I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
So today we're branching out a little bit. This is our second part of a two-part series on the Journey to the West.
Previously, we did some podcast on the novel Journey to the West, which is a 100-chapter novel about a Buddhist monk and his companions, the most interesting being Monkey, with various names. And we looked at that. That's by far one of the most famous pieces of Chinese literature.
Yep.
It's one of the Sida Qishu, the four great novels of the Ming Dynasty. In fact, we talked about it, but it's of course one of the earlier novels of the Chinese tradition. And so now this week we're looking at something that's a bit more mature, I would say a bit more kind of psychologically oriented. And so previously the name of the Journey to the West is Xiou Ji. What we're looking at today is Xiou Bu. Xiou is just Journey to the West.
Right.
Or Journey
Westward Journey.
Something. So this is the addendum to the Journey of the West, the supplement to the Journey of the West, something like that.
So, and I haven't read this. This will be a little bit different for us because usually we talk about something we've both read and we discuss it, debate it, whatever. But I haven't read this today. I'm going to be more or less interviewing Lee. I should point out that this sort of addendum has a fairly long tradition in China, especially once we get into the Qing Dynasty. There's a lot of sort of modern-day adaptations or extensions of especially Dream of Red Chambers, Dream of Red Mansion, Story of the Stone. They're sort of the same title, but a lot of additions to the story. And so this is one. So I'm going to basically just be interviewing Lee, and he's going to tell us all about it because he's the expert on this story. Between the two people currently in this room, he is the expert.
You know, in some ways, it's not an outrage. It's a less outrageous claim than it normally would be, because there's actually not that much written on the Xiou Bu. The Xiou Bu, which is, we should point out, sometimes translated into English as Tower of Myriad Mirrors.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. It just keeps getting crazier. It's not really that studied within even the Chinese tradition. There has been some scholarship on it in Chinese. In English, there's little to no scholarship, and so I don't know. I mean, I've written a paper on it, so I may be one of the more qualified people to talk about this. That's not saying anything about me. That's saying a lot about how little attention this novel gets.
We're walking on very, very thin ice in this podcast.
Yep.
So tell us, Lee. Because we talked about Journey to the West last time when it was more or less a picaresque novel, this quartet of people traveling. And it functioned a little bit like, say, Don Quixote, where they just have a series of adventures, which you can read them in sequence or not. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
What is the Xiou Bu about? What is it?
So it's set in the middle of the Journey to the West. So as they're moving westward, there's a very famous scene, I believe, chapters in the Xiou Ji, so that's the Journey to the West. I think chapters 61 through 63, where Monkey, who is sort of the hero of the Journey to the West, they're trying to cross the Flaming Mountains, which are, a real geographic feature in Xinjiang that has been mythologized, and they can't figure out how, and eventually they have to find this magical fan that this kind of foreign devil witch has. And
as all foreign devil witches tend to have, absolutely, as we all know.
And she won't give it to them, so Monkey shrinks in size and jumps into her stomach. And he eventually beats her internally until she gives up and gives them the fan. And they're able to cross. And this novel, the supplement to the Journey of the West, picks up right in the middle there. And essentially they're kind of walking around, and then they see these very attractive young girls and young boys, and some other stuff happens. And Monkey, it turns out, falls asleep, but he doesn't realize it. And the narrative's interesting because we don't realize that he's fallen asleep either. And so then all this kind of crazy, weird stuff starts to happen. And he goes and he finds this dynasty called the New Tang Dynasty. And it's 38 generations after, one of the founding emperors of the Tang Dynasty. And then he just kind of randomly ends up in this thing called the Tower of Myriad Mirrors. And these mirrors aren't really mirrors at all. They're actually worlds, portals to worlds that he can kind of slip into and out of. And he goes through this series of adventures, and he's trying to figure out his way through this. And he slowly realizes that something weird is going on, that this is not the world that he knows. And eventually, he comes to realize that he's within the dream he's in some sort of dream. And by the end of the novel, he is actually called out of the dream by a man who I would argue is his own voice. And it turns out that Monkey's arch nemesis, who you never know about, who is, I believe, invented by this novel, he's called the Qingyu, or the fish of desire. He is the one who's making this dream up. And he's concocted this dream and enticed Monkey into it. And he is doing this so that he can swallow... He wants to devour the Tang priest who Monkey is supposed to be protecting. So Tripitaka is the name of the Tang priest. He's the guy who is going from China to India to get the Buddhist scriptures. And that is who the fish of desire wants to eat. And it's all just this very random, weird kind of fragmentary.
I should jump in here and say that if you're listening to Lee summarize this and you're thinking,
that doesn't make any sense at all.
Or it would be nice if he would just kind of give us a quick 30-second summary. You can't. In these old classic novels, you can't. Partly because they're written so episodically. You have this thing happens, and this thing happens. And you can't break them down into like a neat little 1-minute chunk.
So this novel is incredibly... First off, it's incredibly fragmentary. Just this, you're literally slipping between worlds constantly. And Monkey, the narrator...
Oh, wait, hang on a second. Let me jump in. So Monkey is the narrator of it.
Monkey is actually...
So it's a first-person thing?
The narrator. I'm sorry. I should take that back. Monkey is kind of... He's not actually narrating it, but it's very much focalized on Monkey. Okay. So when we use the term focalization, we should probably footnote that really quickly. Can you tell us what focalization is, since you're the narratologist?
I'm not a narratologist.
You are a narratologist.
I'm really not. It's the focal point of the novel. I mean, and sometimes this takes the form of, say, free and direct discourse. Sometimes it's first person, but in any sense, it's the lens through which you're seeing the novel.
So for most of the novel, even though Monkey is not the narrator, he is the point through which we are seeing.
Think Harry Potter in the Harry Potter series.
Good, yeah.
So it's not actually free and direct discourse, which is actually a fairly modern invention, like late 19th century. But Monkey's the center. We're viewing this through Monkey.
Yeah. So it's kind of similar to free and direct discourse in some ways, but it's it is in a lot of ways, I think, a very modern novel. That fragmentary nature that I mentioned is this almost kind of psychological fragmentation. And it's written, actually, interestingly, we don't know the exact date. The closest thing we have to a date is, I believe there's a note by the author. Oh, we haven't even used the author's name. His name is Dong Yue, and he is a Buddhist from the Jiangnan region of China, which is kind of the lower reaches of the Yangtze River. And Dong Yue has a note, I believe, written in 1650, where he says, I wrote that novel about 10 years ago. Now, tell me what you know about 1640. What's big that's happening in China right around then?
Well, let's see. That would be when the Qing begins to overrun the Ming.
Yep. The Qing actually overruns the Ming fully pretty much in 1644. But the Qing is actually, so the Qing is a Manchu dynasty. It's not what we would today call Han Chinese. And the Ming dynasty is the Han Chinese dynasty, and they're in the south in what is largely today China. But the Qing is established in what's today northeast China or Manchuria in 1636. So the Qing is already established at the point that the novel is being written.
Okay.
And there's something weird going on. I make the argument in this paper that I wrote that the Qing fish, the fish of desire, is
the Qing.
It's the Qing, you know. It's.
I should jump here with a quick intervention. This is Lee's favorite turf.
Yeah.
This intersection between, not the intersection, like political allegory. This is like your jam.
It is, and pretty much any time I always see.
Lee was the one. I should just jump in. Lee was the one who almost drove our professor nuts in the seminar we took on Ming Qing short fiction, because anytime he'd speak up, she would go, "All right, Lee, what's the political reading in this?"
But yeah, so I mean, there's definitely something going on there. It's unclear. I mean, I don't think that this podcast is the space to make that argument, but there's something really weird about foreignness going on here.
So that was going to be my question, is that it seems to be, based on your description, a weird sort of porousness about reality. Like, is it real? Is it not? Is it dream? Is it not? How would you know?
So it is all dream. It's 100% dream, except for the first chapter. So it's 16 chapters long, and the first chapter, it's unclear where he actually enters the dream. It's very clear where he leaves the dream in at the very beginning of chapter 16. But the sort of kind of like psychological nature of the dream world is something that he's playing with, and he's coming out of the tradition of, Zhuangzi, of course, starts it. But then there's like Tao Yuanming, who is also kind of playing on this kind of porous reality. Chuangqi and Zhi Guai in earlier Chinese dynasties are playing with these. I mean, we did Pu Songling, a man in his
rock.
The man in his rock, the love story. That's playing with this same kind of tradition. And Pu Songling, of course, is published much, maybe a few decades after this. But they're both kind of working with this tradition of kind of messing with reality.
So what do you do with this? Since it's written in essentially the waning years of the Ming Dynasty, do you see any connection between this porousness of reality, like the dream and the reality in the narration can be sort of blended together? Is there a connection for you between that and the political state of the Ming?
I think that, so putting aside my kind of
bias,
my kind of need to read everything politically, I think that even getting beyond that, you have to say that in the late Ming, a lot of people are talking about how things are just, the whole world seems to be falling apart and coming down. And I think that the fact that you're going from one world to the next, Monkey literally rolls from the world of the future to the world of the ancients. And in the middle, he meets the new ancient. Shinren Guren, I think is his name. It just kind of doesn't really, on its surface, it doesn't really make sense. And it sort of seems to reject, in some ways, any attempt for us to make sense. And the way that you can kind of shoot in between worlds in this tower of myriad mirrors. You can go from one world to the next, and Monkey literally rolls from one world to the next. It does seem to reflect that kind of, things are just falling apart.
And so, and narratively, this is, stop me if I'm wrong, but this is quite different from COG, because COG is more or less linear, right?
It's linear and cyclical. Like you're moving, so COG, you're moving towards the destination in the end. This is kind of constantly circular in the way that COG is like cycles, self-contained cycles that you can kind of like pick up and put down. It is definitely very connected, but it's more connected in a broken kind of way. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and Lee points out, he gave us kind of a barrage of names a second ago, but this notion of there being either a connection between or a very fuzzy boundary between dream and reality is a very old tradition in China. I mean, we go back to Zhuangzi's famous sort of conundrum about the butterfly. When I awoke, was it the butterfly dreaming Zhuangzi or Zhuangzi the butterfly? Do you put this in line with that sort of tradition, or is this something a little different for you?
It's definitely different. It is definitely self-consciously trying to do something that I don't think anyone in the Chinese tradition had done before. It's sort of locating itself in a Buddhist argument in that he is a monk, he's a Buddhist monk, and he's couching the story in Buddhist terms. I'm not so sure that he's really that enthralled with Buddhism. The sort of fish of desire, that qing, is something that's very much supposed to be rejected if you're a Buddhist. So the fact...
Not just the fish of desire, but desire.
Desire itself, yeah, sorry. Desire itself is supposed to be rejected by Buddhism. It's just kind of one of the basic tenets of Buddhism. And so the fact that the novel is him being seduced by desire into a dream that is all illusory, which of course illusion is one of the kind of like another basic tenet of Buddhism, that suggests that he's kind of putting himself in this Buddhist thing. But I don't really buy that he's actually talking about Buddhism.
So if he's not talking about Buddhism, what is he talking about?
I mean, I think he's talking about...
So for the listener who may or may not be clear on the political ramifications of the conquering of the Ming by the Qing, how does this sort of cyclicality, this dream sequence connect to the Qing and overtaking the Ming?
Yeah, I mean, I think without having actually read the novel, it's hard to explain. But I'll point out two kind of plot elements that are very important. So the first half of the novel, Monkey is traveling around through these worlds just randomly, and he's got one desire. He's eventually supposed to meet up with his master and help him get past those flaming mountains that we mentioned. But during that whole first half, he's trying to find Qin Shi Huang. So Qin Shi Huang is, of course, the first emperor to unify all of what is today China into a single political unit. He is interesting because he does it in this very kind of violent way, as most, kind of imposed political unities are. But he is also sort of associated with foreigners. There was always this question of the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty was from like 230 to 220 BC, something like that.
Very short dynasty.
Very short. It's right before the Han dynasty. Anyways, there always this kind of question of whether or not they were actually quote-unquote Chinese. And I'm using the word Chinese very glibly here because it's not clear that we can actually talk about China at this point. But anyways, the whole time that Monkey is in this first half of the novel, he's going around saying like, hey, where is Emperor Qin? I want to get his mountain moving bell because he thinks that can kind of move these mountains that are in his way. And, it's just kind of like, what? It's really unclear, like, why he all of a sudden has this new kind of purpose to his journey. It sort of makes sense, but it sort of doesn't. Again, this novel is not very well read because it doesn't really make that much sense. So if don't try and make sense of it. Just accept, kind of, accept what I'm saying for the sake of argument. For the sake of argument, not necessarily because I'm making a good argument. But anyways, there's something weird where he goes into what's called the world of the future. And then all of a sudden this like demon comes out and he's like, hey, we need you to come be the king of hell for a little while. And he's like, oh, I'm trying to like do something here. I'm trying to find this this bell from Emperor Qin. And they're like, don't worry about it. And then they take him down to hell, and he judges this guy named Qin Hui. So Qin Hui, this is the exact same Qin as in the Qin dynasty. But Qin Hui is, he's famous in kind of Chinese literature and Chinese history for being the guy who betrays China and sells China out to these northern tribal people. And this is in the Song dynasty. So he's doing this around 1130s, something like that. And anyways, the whole chapters 8, 9, and 10 pretty much are concerned with this period in hell where Monkey has taken on the role of a judge in hell. And it's all about him like tormenting Qin Hui. And at the end of chapter 10, it actually says, and I'm sorry, chapter 9, the novel itself says, hey, this is a really long and really fun part of the novel. This is important. You should make note of it. And then after that, he just kind of gives up on his journey to find the bell by Emperor Qin. And there's this weird kind of like connection. Again, it doesn't make sense in a sort of narrative way, but there's something going on there.
How does that connect to the Qing? Like the actual overtaking of the Ming by the Qing?
So the word Qin, so in English this is spelled, so Qin Hui and Qin dynasty are both spelled Q-I-N. And Qing, as in the fish of Qing or the fish of desire, is Q-I-N-G.
Which would also be the same as, not the exact same character, but the same sound, at least, as the Qing dynasty, which is what we're talking about.
Right, the same sound, but different tone. So there's a history of kind of interpretation of the word Qin and Qing to be the same thing. My understanding is in the southern versions of the Chinese language, this we're talking about kind of in Cantonese or Taiwanese, those actually sound the same. Even if they are different tones, they sound the same. So they're homophonic. And there's this tradition of interpreting Qin things to mean Qing.
And this is also, by the way, if that sounds somewhat tenuous to any of you, there's a long history in Chinese literature of using puns or using similar sounds as a way of or actually as allusion. Like the best example I can think of off the top of my head is if you're in China and you're drinking toasts with people, no one finishes a glass of alcohol like a bottoms up shot on the fourth toast, because the Chinese word for four is si, but the Chinese word for death is si.
Yeah.
Now they're not the same character, but they're similar sounds, and because they're similar, they're associated.
And traditionally in China, you can't give a clock as a present because it sounds like the word that means end or death.
Yeah.
So these kinds of things, we're not making them up. And commentators in other novels are talking about this. So, this novel in which it's incredibly weird, in which the world feels like it's falling apart. And it's written right as the Ming Dynasty is actually falling apart.
And there's a core section wherein Monkey judges someone who betrays the southern kingdom to a northern kingdom, which would be what was happening with the Ming and the Qing.
Right. And he betrays them. He betrays the Han Chinese dynasty to a group called the Jurchen. And the Jurchen are the ancestors of the Manchus. So it's a little bit of a stretch, but I don't think it's that much of a stretch.
So you mentioned that because it's very chaotic in the way it's written, that it's not particularly well studied.
It's not well studied, and it's also not incredible. Like the Chinese is not incredibly beautiful.
Okay. So why study this? Why write a paper about this if it's A, not particularly well written, and B, not well studied?
I think that, I mean, it's kind of like that for me as a literature guy, that's like asking, why climb that mountain that no one's climbed before? I mean, I think that one of the reasons this hasn't been studied is because no one can make sense of it. And once you make sense of it, like if one can make sense of it in the way that I'm trying to make sense of it, it becomes like climbing a sort of literary mountain. It's just fun to do because it's over there. Like, yeah.
And there are definitely political readings of the COG and any of the classics as well. One of the things commonly, I think, done in modern China, and I'll qualify modern here as anything post-Qing dynasty, like post-takeover of the Ming by the Qing. Although one of the common things done is to look to the past for a political allegory. Because it's safe, right?
Although, that's something that goes back thousands of years.
Yes, that's true. That's true. You're right. It does go back thousands of years. You don't want to lampoon the current leaders, and so you bring in a similar situation from a few dynasties ago and do that. So that's also kind of a way of looking at this.
We should point out that in the, I guess, 1640s, 1650s, this is an incredibly sensitive time because the Qing had just established their empire. They were still very insecure. In fact, the Qing did not fully secure Yunnan in the southwest until 1682, I want to say, and I think a little bit later until they actually expelled some Ming loyalists from Taiwan. But so the Qing is incredibly insecure. And in fact, using the word Qing, that particular character, not just something that sounds like Qing, but it had to be that particular character,
right,
in a way that the Qing censors found problematic, could land you on the execution table. And so it's unlikely that this guy, Dong Yue, was actually writing this after 1644. We don't really know the date, but if he says in 1650 that I read it about 10 years ago, it's highly likely that he would not be dumb enough to write something like this in 1645.
Right.
Because people were getting their heads lopped off, or people were getting choked to death for things that are similar. And I would say that are even less explicit, that are totally accidental.
So the question of why study this, one of the reasons you might want to study this is because somebody had to really want to tell this story to be able to tell it in this political climate. So something was at stake here for this guy.
Yeah.
So do you have any parting thoughts for us?
You know, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book.
I don't know. Could you even find an English translation?
Yeah, there's a good English translation. Yeah, it's there's it was published in Taipei in the 70s.
Okay.
I think Lin and Schutz did something. A Chinese and American a pair of translators did it in the 70s in Taipei when Taiwan was under kind of KMT dictatorship. And so it has this kind of like stilted 1970s translation sense to it. It's really kind of, even reading the English is very weird. I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading it. Certainly the podcast that we did last week, the Shioji, that book is much more important and more relevant. And if the listener is kind of thinking, I want to know about Chinese culture, that's the thing to go to. This is like very obscure. But I think that I wanted to bring it up because it says something about how these mythological novels, and I would argue that you know, that the Shioji is definitely a mythological novel, are kind of reused and repurposed in very strange but still very interesting ways.
All right. I obviously don't have any parting thoughts because I didn't read this, except to say that if you are interested in connections between literature and actual culture, looking at the continuing impact of the COG and anything to do with the COG.
The
is
COG
huge.
today, I mean...
It's by far the most... No, it's not the most popular. It's the most fun of the 4 classics. And
I'll have to say, I don't actually like it that much.
I don't like it either. I'm speaking more from the Chinese perspective.
Sure.
If you're a Chinese person and you have a choice between watching a TV show based on COG or
something else,
you're going to watch that.
And you can find tons of like television shows with the COG, but I don't think there's been anything on the Shiobu. I would love to see it if there was something on the Shiobu.
If you're a listener and you're interested in this, make something on the Shiobu.
Maybe a comic strip or something on the Shiobu. That would be fun.
That would be.
All right.
So that's it. I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.